why are we returning to the 17th century in 2018? Because one thing I think isn't very clear, and I would actually think that there's a minority of us who think this, from the ecumenical patriarchate's perspective, and I kind of wish there was someone here who could speak on their behalf, there is no Kievan Patriarchate anymore. There is no autocephalous church. Everyone in Ukraine is under their canonical jurisdiction. They have essentially rebooted the Kievan Metropolia of the 17th century by reclaiming that canonical authority. And that is the canonical path, the argument. This is the only way that they can take this action and the only justification for instructing Metropolitan Onufri that once the election takes place, you no longer have the right to bear that title. So from their perspective, there is a Kievan Metropolia, and everyone is under their jurisdiction now. And I've heard bits and pieces that some churches in Kiev are commemorating him liturgically. And that would be a ritualization of this canonical authority. And I think when when Filaret and the Synod decreed that his official title in intra-Orthodox relations is now Archbishop of Kiev and Metropolitan of all Rus in Ukraine, that this was a nod to the canonical presence and the reestablishment of the Stavropegion of Constantinople in Ukraine. And my understanding is that they're going to have a handful of churches where they will retain a presence in Ukraine. And I personally think that that's wise, because this post-December 15th period is going to be tumultuous. There's no getting around it. So I don't know if people have a sense that, my understanding is that in Ukraine people are saying, well, what's a tomos? We've never heard of this before. And it's people, and you're buying pirashke and you're talking about a tomos and autocephaly. So, that's a very difficult issue. Now, about the state issue, I think that's very important. I think it's very embedded into those of us who are in the West, maybe not all of us, that we just take for granted of separation of church and state. And if you think about, just imagine for a minute, let's leave Ukraine for a minute and go to Moscow. The conditions of the Moscow Council of 1917 to 18, a council which was funded by the Kerensky government. And you have already trying to adjust to this change and unable to, under severe pressure to draft a document that will be part of the statute of how they're going to relate to the state. There's actually fascinating scholarship in Ukraine. Who do we commemorate at the Great Litany? Do we commemorate the Hetmanate, Skoropadsky? Do we commemorate, and there's a debate amongst Litkivsky and his cohorts in the 1921 council, do we commemorate the Soviet authorities? And they have to come up with a theological justification for this. So we see this attempt to adjust to the state. And whatever one makes of the church historian Vlasovsky, and one of the things that I thought was very helpful is he does address this matter of state and church when he is attempting to justify the directory's establishment of a law of establishing a canonical autocephalous church. And he basically says, this is all they've ever known, is everything always occurs in conjunction with the state. And that's why I mentioned Bishop Boris's article of the elevation of the patriarchate, because I think it's very important to have a sense of just how powerful of a role the Russian aristocracy and the Tsar and the entire imperial court played in playing political games with the Constantinopolitan delegation during the process of elevating Moscow from a metropolia to a patriarchate. And so what I think that we're seeing today is in the post-Soviet period, you simply cannot disentangle state interests from the church. It's not possible. We want to, and we want to impose our values upon them. But the state, anytime the church is creating political problems in the state is going to make a statement. We talked about Yushchenko, Poroshenko, Yanukovych basically agreed to a stational liturgy in 2013 that went through Kyiv, Moscow, and Minsk to demonstrate the unity of the three core nations of the Ruski Mir. And in each instance, the presidents of the country met with the bishops. And the Ukrainians love to post pictures of Putin giving an award to all of the different metropolitans in the Ukrainian church under Moscow. But I think that this is the reality that they're dealing with. The other reality is, well, what about the two statements made by the United States State Department? Or Erdogan's role in all of this? And those are realities that we have to honor and confess. I think there's a great deal of positioning happening here. And with the ecumenical patriarchate, they're being deliberately pithy and terse in what they're willing to say about their motivations. I mean, what has he said publicly? Ukraine deserves it, and we're using the Balkan pattern for autocephaly. And it's generating a lot of interesting discussion among Orthodox theologians. I'm speculating here, but I think that there's been a crack in the relations between Constantinople and Moscow for decades, and that Crete widened that gap enough where the ecumenical patriarchate is trying to reassert their definition of primacy in the Orthodox world, and the nervous responses of the other churches, to me, in my estimation, shows that we do not have a consensus within the church on what primacy is.
Dr. Tatana, I just one quick comment and a bit more about the. When I read the Kievan Patriarchate statement on titles, I thought, "Welcome to the Greco-Catholic world." I think your last point about the ecumenical patriarchy, I think that the past, I will say, 50 years need to be looked at in terms of how Constantinople has related to Moscow. Because regardless of what happened before, I mean, let's remember that at Vatican II, Moscow trumped Constantinople. Because there were ongoing discussions about having a delegation from Constantinople to come to Vatican II as observers. And at the last minute, Moscow said, if you do that, you're in trouble. Constantinople pulled out, Moscow went. In that whole period of the past 50 years, Moscow has tried continually to position itself as the preeminent see within Orthodoxy. They invited Constantinople to move to Switzerland, right? Because they would have a better position there than Turkey. Why? So they couldn't claim to be the Church of Constantinople anymore. So I agree. That relationship has to be looked at, because that's an important part of what's been happening, I think, in terms of Ukraine over the past few years. Immensely huge. And I think you're right. Great and Holy Council was the last straw, I think, for Constantinople.
And Havana.
Yeah, and Havana. Oh, yeah, Havana.
And then you have also the International Orthodox Dialogue, where the Russian delegation walked out of the discussions and refused to sign the declaration on primacy within the church.
Yep.
So, question here.